All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really get into something pretty big, pretty complex, and it's developing right now as we speak, the U.S.-China trade situation.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on there and a lot of potential impact.
For sure. I mean, you sent over a couple articles that I think really capture the essence of this, right? One from Politico, no reprieve for the economy. Trump's surging China tariffs will upend billions in trade. And then from onenews.co.nz, Xi will not be forced into a call. U.S.-China trade war escalates. I mean, we've got experts weighing in. We've got reporters on the ground. So I think this is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to see, where all of this goes because, I mean, what we're seeing is this real escalation of tension, right? President Trump announcing this big increase in tariffs on goods coming from China, a major trade partner, obviously. Then at the same time, he's kind of hitting the pause button on some of those tariff increases that were announced, for other trading partners. So it's a pretty interesting move.
Yeah, like what's the strategy here? What's the big question we need to answer for ourselves as we go through this?
I think it comes down to, what are the consequences? What's going to happen? What are the economic, impacts, both here in the U.S. and globally? And then maybe even more importantly, how's this all going to play out? What are the responses going to be from Washington and from Beijing? We really need to distill these reports down into some core insights so we can kind of get a handle on this whole complex situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take these articles, look at what the experts are saying, the political figures, what's happening on the ground, all that, really pull out those key points, so we can all understand what's going on with this whole trade situation without getting too bogged down.
Exactly.
So let's get down to it. What did Trump actually do here? What's he saying?
Yeah, let's start with the specifics of these recent moves, right? What did he announce? Why is he doing it? Particularly this focus on China.
Okay, so the Politico article mentions that Trump, he went on Truth Social. I guess that's his favorite way to communicate these days, right?
Seemed like it.
And he announces this tariff increase on Chinese goods to at least 125%. I mean, that's a pretty big jump.
It is a big jump, yeah.
And then, he says that he's sticking with this baseline tariff of at least 10% on like almost all U.S. imports.
Wow.
And just to put that in perspective, we're talking about $3.2 trillion last year in imports.
That's huge.
It is. But then on the other hand, he's putting a 90-day hold on those other tariffs, the higher ones, for the EU and a bunch of other trading partners, like 60 of them.
So it seems like he's really targeting China specifically right now, at least for the time being, giving everyone else a bit of break.
Yeah, like a timeout, right?
Right. But what's his end game here? What's he trying to accomplish with all this?
Well, Politico quotes him directly, and he basically says he thinks these tariffs are going to force President Xi, the Chinese president, to come to the negotiating table and cut a deal that works for the U.S., obviously.
Okay.
He even goes on to say that, President Xi's a smart guy and he's expecting a call, leading to this very good deal for both. So it's very much him, taking this personal approach.
Very interesting.
Yes.
The One News article, they touch on this too. They mention how Trump has said that China's been disrespectful to global markets. But the big question is this going to work? Will this pressure actually get China to do what he wants?
Exactly, right. I mean, the Politico piece has this quote from Ed Gresser. He's with the Progressive Policy Institute. And he says, this is almost like an embargo, these tariff levels. It's similar to how the U.S. treated China way back in the 50s and 60s. So, I mean, it's pretty serious stuff.
Wow, that really puts it into perspective, right? I mean, that's a pretty strong comparison.
Yeah.
So let's think about this, okay? How is this all going to impact the U.S. economy? What are the experts saying about these China tariffs?
Right. So Politico raises this concern about prices going up for, everyday Americans.
Makes sense?
Because China makes so much of what we buy, clothes, electronics, toys, all that, and this huge increase in the import tax, it's going to mean higher prices, for all that stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty much a given.
And even beyond that, like, the things that American companies use to make stuff, all those components and materials, the prices on those are going to go up too.
Makes sense.
And they quote Jason Furman. He used to be the head of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And he's saying this increase on China is probably going to cancel out any of the good stuff from those other tariffs being paused.
So it's kind of a wash, right? Like any relief we might feel from that is going to be wiped out by the China tariff.
Exactly, yeah.
So we're not just talking about higher prices, right? We're talking about people changing how they shop, maybe looking for cheaper options, maybe buying more American-made products. or stuff from other countries.
Right. Yeah.
This could actually change the whole game for Chinese products here in the U.S.
And even beyond that, I mean, China makes so much stuff that we buy. These tariffs could really drive up prices across the board, inflation.
For sure, for sure. And what about our exports? What about American businesses trying to sell things to China,
Yeah.
especially farmers?
Right. Oh, that's a big one. And Politico talks about that too.
Yeah.
China is such a huge market for American farmers, and we saw what happened when Trump did this before during his first term. Exports just plummeted.
It did not go well.
Not at all. And they're worried it's going to happen again, especially since last year we sent over $24 billion worth of agricultural stuff to China. That's like 13% of all our farm exports.
Wow.
Yeah, if that dries up, it's going to really hurt American farmers.
For sure. And it's not just about selling less, right?
Okay.
It affects prices all over the world when supply and demand get messed up like that.
Exactly.
And Politico also mentioned something else. It's something that's not about economics directly, but it's about the fentanyl crisis and how this could affect cooperation with China on that.
Right. Senator Wyden said he's worried that this whole trade war could mean less cooperation on fighting fentanyl, which is obviously a huge problem.
Yeah, it really shows how connected trade is to other important global issues.
It does, for sure.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Look at this from China's point of view.
Okay.
According to One News, what are they saying about all this? Is Trump's strategy working on them? Are they ready to negotiate?
Well, from what One News is reporting, it doesn't seem like Trump's tactics are really having the effect he wants, at least not yet.
Interesting.
They quote Daniel Russell from the Asia Society Policy Institute, and he says that China's plan is to stand firm, absorb pressure, and let Trump overplay his hand.
Okay, so they're playing the waiting game.
Right.
It seems that way, yeah.
Interesting. And I guess they think that if they give Trump anything, he'll just see it as weakness, so they're not budging.
Right.
One News also quotes Sun Yun from the Stimson Center, and she says flat out that President Xi is not going to call Trump. Like, he's not going to just pick up the phone.
Yeah. She says, it's just not how they do things, Chinese leaders don't really make those kinds of calls.
Unless it's something huge, like 911.
Exactly. That was a rare exception. And it shows just how unusual it would be for President Xi to call Trump out of the blue.
It really shows how differently these two sides see things, right? How they're supposed to interact.
Absolutely. And Craig Singleton from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, he calls this whole thing a test of wills.
Yeah, and One News also points out that China has straight up said they will not give in to what they call U.S. bullying.
So they're digging in their heels, huh? They're ready for a fight.
It seems that way, and they're saying they've been preparing for this. They even have an editorial in the People's Daily where they talk about how they've accumulated rich struggle experience over the last 8 years of trade problems with the U.S.
Wow. Rich struggle experience.
Yeah, right. And they're projecting this image of strength, saying they're not so reliant on the U.S. anymore, that they're focusing on their own consumers. And their message is basically, we're not scared, we're not backing down.
The sky will not fall, right?
Exactly, yeah.
They sound pretty confident, like they learned a lot from those past tariff battles.
Yeah, and One News has this quote from Melanie Hart. She's with the Atlantic Council, and she says that China's ready to use everything they've got against the U.S., their whole toolkit, she calls it.
So more than just tariffs then?
Oh, yeah, they're talking about blacklisting companies, hurting American farmers with import restrictions, even maybe limiting the supply of important minerals, like the stuff we need to make things.
So this could get really messy really fast.
It could, but even with all that, both the People's Daily and Xinhua News Agency, they're both saying that China's still open to talking, that they don't really want a trade war, but they're ready for one.
Right, that no winners thing.
Exactly, yeah.
It's interesting how they always say that.
It is, but okay, let's zoom back in on the U.S., see how people here are reacting to all this, beyond the White House.
Yeah, good idea. What's the word on the street, so to speak?
Well, Politico says there's some nervousness, even among the Republicans. Yeah, they quote Senator Tillis, and he's saying that while he's glad those tariffs on our allies are on hold, it doesn't really solve the problem unless they can get a solid trade deal in place quickly.
So, yeah, there's relief, but also this underlying worry.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
it's not just smooth sailing for Trump on this, even within his own party.
Definitely not. And then we have Senator Rand Paul, who's always been against tariffs. He says a 10% tariff is better than a 60% one, but it's still not good.
Yeah.
And he makes a really interesting point about Taiwan, saying that trade with China is actually important for U.S. foreign policy, and it helps American consumers, too. So he's worried about what this could mean for Taiwan, since they do a lot of business with China.
So he's saying that even though there's tension, trade with China can actually be a good thing.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Interesting.
It is, and then from the Democrats, well, they're not holding back. Senator Wyden, Politico, quotes him saying this is basically a new 10% tax on everything Americans buy, and that it's just going to make things worse for businesses and families and create a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, so pretty strong criticism from that side.
Yeah, definitely not happy.
So let's take a minute here and just think about the scale of all this. The sheer size of the trade relationship between the U.S. and China.
It's massive.
It is, and Politico has some numbers that really drive that home. In 2024, the U.S. imported $438 billion worth of stuff from China.
Wow.
Yeah, smartphones, laptops, clothes, toys, all that.
Mhm.
And also the parts and equipment that our businesses need. That's over 13% of all the imports coming into the U.S.
That's a huge chunk.
It is, and it's not like China's just sitting there. They've already hit a bunch of American goods with extra duties, like 84% on average.
Oh, wow, so they're not backing down either.
Nope, not at all.
What about the other way around? How much are we selling to them?
Well, last year, the U.S. exported about $143 billion worth of goods to China, which is about 7% of all our exports, or 9% if you include Hong Kong. And a big chunk of that, like we talked about before, is agricultural products, over $24 billion worth.
Right, that's a lot of soybeans and corn and stuff. Yeah, exactly. And if those exports drop, that could really hurt, lead to a bigger trade deficit for us.
So it's a pretty tangled web, and both sides seem pretty dug in. What do you think could happen next?
Well, Politico brings up the possibility of Trump trying to make a new trade deal, maybe something like that phase one deal they had a while back.
Right. Yeah.
And the fact that he invited a Chinese official to his inauguration, maybe that's a sign that he's still open to working things out.
Could be. But one news says China doesn't seem too keen on being pushed around. They seem to be ready for this trade fight to go on for a while.
Yeah, definitely getting that sense.
So to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, it's clear that Trump has really upped the ante with these tariffs on China while giving other trading partners a break. And it seems like his main goal is to get China to negotiate a trade deal that works for him.
Right. His way or the highway, kind of.
Exactly, but both these articles, they make it very clear that China's not playing that game. They see this as bullying, and they're ready to fight back. They've got a whole arsenal of economic weapons they can use.
And it's not just posturing. They've shown they're willing to use them.
Right, exactly. And both sides are going to feel the pain here. Prices are going to go up in the U.S., or exports could take a hit, and China's economy is going to suffer too. And on top of all that, it's making the whole global trade situation really unpredictable.
Yeah, lots of uncertainty, which is never good for business.
Definitely not.
So this brings up a really interesting question, something to think about. China has this long-term plan to focus more on their own consumers and become less dependent on the U.S., right?
Right.
So how is this whole tariff war going to change things in the long run? Not just prices and trade deficits, but the whole global economy. Supply chains, everything. What's going to happen to other countries as this all plays out? New relationships, new opportunities, who knows? It's a big shift, and the consequences could be huge.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
See you next time.
See ya.